Hello, BookTube, and welcome back to the Steve Tiberius Donoghue Book Club. I've started a book club on this channel. We read a book every month, and this month we're reading this Republic of Suffering. A meditation on the American Civil War, not really a battle-by-battle, political speech narrative history of the war, but rather an extremely thoughtful examination of what it meant for the people involved. Last time, we're taking a leisurely stroll through this book. It's not a crusher for the month of July. We have 5 weekends. This is not a long book, so I'm hoping that all of you are not killing yourselves to get through this. But last time we dealt with the concept of accountability, literal accountability. How do you know who fought and what happened to them? And I was obsessing about that. I talked about it in my video, but I was also obsessing about it just off camera as well, thinking about that, what that would be like. You send your only boy off to war. You stop hearing from him, and no one can tell you what happened to him. If you are his mother, you want to know his life to the very last minute the way you knew it from the very first minute. And you don't, and you never will. Was he shot by accident? Did he die in a mudslide? Whether it's the Crimean War or the American Civil War or most of World War I, you'll never know. You just have to live with that. You don't even know 100% for sure if he is dead. Very different thing from the so-called accountability of later wars. There's a whole discussion that could be made there about how that is a reflection of the fact that war was established on a business footing and you need payroll. That's a darker subject, a darker reading of that subject. But today, the thing that's sticking in my mind is not so much death as God. The American Civil War was a very religious war, and religion was invoked incessantly on all sides, from pulpits, from battlefields, from national leaders, from generals, just endlessly. I would argue that probably most of the books that have been written about this subject have religious motif titles, and so on and so forth, right down the line in terms of considering what this was like. We get, for instance, let me see if I can find it here, we get an echo of Abraham Lincoln's second inaugural address, the strangest and in many ways the most amazing inaugural address that any president has ever given. And we're told, but as Lincoln's second inaugural, delivered on the eve of victory, insisted, God has his own purposes and makes his own judgments. He, and neither Yankees nor Confederates, would define the reach of his providence. Both sides in the terrible conflict read the same Bible, pray to the same God, and each invokes his aid against the other. The prayers of both could not be answered. Northern success and Southern defeat necessarily altered providential explanations of war and its carnage. I love it. I mentioned this last time, I love how this author works so much poetic, expansive thought into powerhouse lines like that. Let me read that again. You're flying along on these pages, you might miss things like that. Northern success and Southern defeat necessarily altered providential explanations of war and its carnage. Northerners were reinforced in their conviction that lives had not been lost in vain and were encouraged in their sense of national mission. Confederates confronted what for many became a profound test of faith. It was a profound test of faith for both sides. But for Confederates, yes indeed, if God blessed their purpose, then God would shield them, and God did not. And I don't want to stress this too much. We'll be coming up on this subject, I think, in this book club anyway. But one of the reasons why the Confederates thought that God blessed their purpose is because the Old Testament and the New Testament of the Bible that both North and South read enthusiastically endorses the practice of slavery. So if you are a Southern politician and you are hearing heaping condemnation being thrown on your way of life, or if you're a normal Southerner, your better's way of life, you're not going to go to states' rights. You're going to go to the Bible as your justification, as your first line of defense. So it was a crisis of faith for the Confederates in a lot of different ways. But there was another crisis. Making sense of carnage like that, there was another crisis here, a deeper crisis of faith, because it wasn't just that both sides read the same Bible and pray to the same God and God can't answer both of them. He can't award victory to both of them. He obviously didn't award victory to both of them, if he awarded victory at all. And that's the other element of this, is that what if it's not a question of which side God was on, but a question of whether or not there is a God at all? The thing that you have to keep in mind for this consideration, the thing that's in the groundwater of these thoughts in this thread that I was picking out for this week's reading, is that the American Civil War was fought in the first 5 years of the 1860s. But in 1859, Charles Darwin published On the Origin of Species. And that you might be thinking, well, we're talking about Chickamauga and Gettysburg. We're talking about ironclads. A book? What difference does a book make? But, as I hope I don't need to tell this particular audience, books make all the difference in the world. They are the most powerful things. At least they were, until the 21st century when nobody reads. But for once upon a time, they were the most powerful things in the world. And Darwin's book had a chance to percolate into the groundwater before the first shot was fired at Fort Sumter. And Darwin's book does not need gods. It offers an organizational concept of how the world works that does not require a god at all. It doesn't make that point. It certainly doesn't harp on that point. But you, in 1859, if you read it, you could not possibly walk away from it without realizing that. Without realizing, well, wait a minute. Okay, this is fairly eloquently done. It's certainly the most interesting scientific treatise that I've ever read. But wait a minute. You're saying species evolve from common ancestors through natural processes of biological competition and representation, reproduction, adaptation to the environment, and that this has always happened. That this accounts for the variety of species in the world. Your program here, you can back it up with all sorts of natural field observations, and in Darwin's own lifetime, fossil proof started to occur, started to be discovered. And then later on came Mendel and genetics that seal it completely. The genetic understanding of life's development rules out, it dramatically supports the theory of evolution by means of natural selection. Darwin didn't live to see a lot of that, but he did live to see some of it. And even before any of it was there, his own observations were pretty solid stuff. And people were reading this book, divines in particular, were reading this book on both sides of the Atlantic and thinking, well, okay, but this doesn't seem to need a god at all. That was a bombshell. No pun intended for the American Civil War battlefields, but that was a bombshell. A bigger one than we tend to think. That was radical, absolutely radical. And it opened the door to the possibility that it's not that God was favoring one side over the other in the American Civil War, but that there aren't any gods at all. These are just animals fighting with technology. And if that's true, then there's no afterlife. There's no ultimate justification for any of this. There's no ultimate comfort. Even if you do take a train to your battlefield and find the mangled corpse of your boy, you know, if you've read a digest or a popularization, or you've read Origin of Species itself, that experience is different for the first time in human history. For the first time in human history, the powers that be, the clerics on either side, the grieving parents, the politicians, had that element in the groundwater. That was not true in the Crusades. That was not true in Angevin Wars of Conquest or anything like that. It wasn't there. It wasn't part of the human mental armament. And now it was. We get an excerpt from the Devil's Dictionary. Ambrose Bierce talks about this, makes a little verse about an afterlife free, a purpose-free life, and especially death, where he writes, "Done with the work of breathing, done with all the world, the mad race run, through to the end, the golden goal, attained and found to be a whole." And the book goes on, the afterlife, for which so many Americans avidly searched, was not heaven, but simply the void of the grave. Death was, quote, hideous, and it was complete in itself. It was not a passage to another life. It was not the embodiment or instrument of patriotic or religious purpose. I don't know who that's referring to. All Americans thought that in the 1860s. Ambrose Bierce might not have. I think there's plenty of evidence that he said it but didn't believe it. But all Americans did believe that it was exactly that. How would we put it? A passage to another life. I think the author just gets that wrong. Just like we're also told, dissenting from his era's romanticization of death, fully embracing the Darwinian notion of quote, nature red in tooth and claw, is how the author describes Ambrose Bierce. But Darwin didn't write nature red in tooth and claw, and there's a lot more subtlety than that to the origin of species. The origin of species is not, things killing things. That's not only things killing things. It's you don't have to kill anybody to succeed in the evolutionary ladder. You just have to adapt better to your environment. You don't have to kill a single member of a species that adapts less well than you. They'll die on their own. That's a very charged way of looking at the subject, but nevertheless, the subject is definitely present. That is the thread that I was pulling on this time around for reading this. Is an odd thread. I don't imagine that many of you are reading this will come down on the same thing, but it was getting on my mind is what do you do with your poor Johnny's death if he's just an evolved ape? Does that make the whole thing harder to do? Of course, that doesn't go anywhere. Troops everywhere are still saturated in religion. They have to be. I don't think many people would continue to take up arms if they weren't saturated to some level with religion. Or were just psychopaths who like to kill people, which we had plenty of those in the American Civil War. But that's not what this book is dealing with. That was the thread that I pulled on this time around. I don't need to go on for great length. We have plenty of time to ruminate about all sorts of things in this book. I'd love to know how you're coming along if you're reading it. But that was the thread that I thought of this time around, was to remember, to remind myself that the origin of species predates the American Civil War. The origin of species was in the groundwater when this war was fought. And I think you can see it bubbling up here and there. People wondering, well, if this book that I read, or that I had read to me, is true, then what isn't true? What does it invalidate? That was not Darwin's purpose at all. Not at all. It was largely on his mind. It was, I believe, a large aspect of why he delayed so long in writing up The Origin of Species. It had to be sort of nudged into it by being the threat of being scooped. I think part of the reason that he was delaying was a sense of the non-scientific uproar that it would create. Same thing with, you see that if you go back a little while earlier, you get Linnaeus, when he was making his great taxonomic trees of life, all life on Earth. He did not, when he was doing that with the great apes, he did not understand why I'm having my friend, the bishop, or my friends, my devout church-going friends telling me, well, okay, but when you get to this particular categorical tree, there's a huge gap, right? There's humans, and then there's all these other apes. And Linnaeus was saying, no, if I weren't worried about having my house burned down, I would say these are the exact same thing. These are in the same family. These are just kinds of apes. In that same way, Darwin knew. Oh, goodness gracious. Oh my goodness. In that same way, Darwin knew, I think, the furor that his book would create, where it would go, where he did not intend. And I think we see a lot of that in Meditations on Death, in this Republic of Suffering. So, anyway, that's just one thread. I could have talked about a million other things. I'm going to wrap this up for now. We'll be back next week. I will see you then. Thank you, BookTube.